Today on Under the Big Tree, time to make your own modules, setting up to do synth DIY. Welcome to Under the Big Tree. Today, we're going to look at what you need to be able to make DIY synth modules. This will be the first in a series of episodes on the topic of SDIY. We will start by learning the tools of the trade. Then, we'll build a small digital oscilloscope and get into buying full kits from DIY module sellers like Synthrotech, Modular Addict, and SynthCube. After a while, we will save even more money by creating a well-stocked collection of commonly used parts, meaning we only need to buy the panel and PCB plus a couple of specialized parts rather than the full kit. Later on down the road, we'll examine debugging your module, hand soldering surface mount parts, using a breadboard to experiment with designing your own circuits, and even getting into programming tiny microprocessors like Teensy and Arduino for use in Eurorack. I started soldering when I was about 8. My grandfather was an engineer, and I'll never forget the first kit he got me, a DIY transistor radio from Radio Shack. I attacked the PCB with gusto, blasting through soldering up the components as quickly as I could, then slapping it into the little plastic case and throwing in a 9-volt battery. The moment had arrived. I picked up my new radio, ready for my moment of triumph, clicked on the volume wheel, and nothing. How could this be? I'm sure I followed all the directions. As I pulled the radio apart and looked at the sea of solder covering the back of the PCB board, I couldn't for the life of me understand why it didn't work. The next time my grandfather was over, I told him about the radio. He opened it up, took a look, and with a straight face, told me that he would take it home and take a look at it. The following weekend, I spent the night at my grandparents' house, and there, sitting on his workbench, was my radio. He was smiling, and I turned the volume wheel up and was greeted with static and the unmistakable sound of Three Dog Night playing one of their hits of the day. I was hooked. I never asked my grandfather how much time he had to spend cleaning up my huge blobs of solder that covered the PCB board. But looking back now, I sure am glad he did. Since that moment over 4 decades ago, I have built theremins, Paya synthesizer and distortion kits, mic preamps, clones of LA2A and 1176 compressors, high-quality mic preamps that use the same transformers as Neve units, clones of Pultec equalizers, as well as the clones of the Neve 33609 compressor and 1081 EQ that you see in the rack behind me. I have soldered enough snakes and cables to wire 10 recording studios, recapped mixing consoles and analog tape recorders, fixed countless persnickety pieces of audio gear, and, of course, built a boatload of Eurorack. All of that activity has given me a fantastic studio worth of toys at a fraction of the cost of buying everything through music retail stores. But more importantly, it has given me the confidence to not fear audio gear and to absolutely love analog technology. I am by no means an expert in analog circuit design and basically have picked up my understanding of electronics in bits and pieces over the years. But you don't need to know the fine points of how a transistor works in order to follow a schematic and solder it onto a PCB board. You need to have some simple tools, a lust for gear that is bigger than what your wallet can handle, curiosity about what's actually going on inside your Eurorack modules, and the desire to do it yourself. I would love to share some of my knowledge and experience along these lines with you. In this episode, I'm going to quickly go over some best safety practices when working with DIY electronics. Then, we will take a look at the basic tools needed and which ones in particular I like. Basic safety rules for electronic DIY. The materials used to create electronic devices are not exactly organic, range-free, and cage-free. There are a lot of toxic chemicals that you come in contact with, so here are a few basic rules to help keep you and those around you safe. Number 1. Ventilate. Every time you heat up solder to the melting point, some vaporized flux in various metals are released into the atmosphere. Not a ton, but you do not want to be breathing it regardless. There are 3 solutions. Work outside if you can have a setup outside and the weather is cooperative. Then no ventilation is needed. Work at a table next to an open window, with a fan blowing the fumes out the window. Try to position the fan relatively near the soldering iron and board, but pointing away from you, making sure the fumes get pushed away from you and out the window. Or use a solder fume extractor. These are basically fans that you place near where the work is happening. It has an activated charcoal filter that presumably traps the fumes in the filter. For it to be effective, it needs to be as close to the work as is feasible. Wash your hands every time you get up. I know that sounds a little OCD, but in this case I think not. Every time you are taking a break or doing something else for a while, the first thing you do is get up and wash your hands thoroughly with soap. That way, if you go off and do something else for a while and then grab a snack, you aren't transferring any of the chemical residue into your body. Pretend that your hands are radioactive until you wash them. They aren't, but that's a good way for me to remember. Next up, soldering and food or drink do not mix. We all love snacking, but if you're working on an electronics project, keep the food and drink in the kitchen as far away from the electronics as possible. It's very simple. You do not want to transfer any of the residue on your fingers to your mouth. Next up, don't touch your eyes or mouth while soldering. It's very easy to rub your eyes at any time, but the moist membranes in your mouth and eyes are another easy way for the residue of your soldering to enter your bloodstream. Have good lighting. I have a small, cheap plastic light that I put right behind what I'm working on, shining bright white light right down to where I need it. Get a magnifier if you need it. I certainly do. I can't imagine soldering anymore without one. Next up, don't let the kids mess with this stuff when you are not around. Don't leave your work surface unattended if you have kids around. They could easily go over and play with the nice bendy wire. Next, this should be obvious, but that soldering iron is freaking hot. This should go without saying, but always respect the metal end of your soldering iron. Never touch it to see if it is on, and always power it down when you're done for a while. To that end, anything metal that comes in contact with this soldering iron is also freaking hot. Don't forget that if you're touching the lead of a component and you start soldering that lead into place, the whole thing gets really hot really quickly. Never solder on a live board. Always make sure the power is off, even if it's a low voltage device. If you have an AC adapter plugged into the unit, physically disconnect it. Remember that capacitors can store charge for a long time. Due to the low voltage aspect of Eurorack, we probably won't be dealing with big power filter capacitors. But if you ever see any really large capacitors, especially near a power supply, do not touch. They can store charge for some time, and if you place yourself between the poles of the cap, it can happily discharge it directly into you. Don't work with high voltage power unless you absolutely know what you're doing. Let me reiterate this. 120 volts can kill you. 220 volts can kill you. No DIY project is worth dying over. If you really knew what you were doing, you probably wouldn't be watching this introductory video. So we can make it easy and just say, don't work with high voltage power. All right, now let's go downstairs and take a look at the tools of the trade. Okay, here we are at our DIY workspace. Now, the most important thing you need, really, is a place to work. And because there's enough equipment that you have, it's better to have that place and leave everything set up, at least until you finish the project that you're currently working on. Can't always happen, and at that point it's really important to put everything away neatly in baggies so you can come back and start up again where you left off. In our case, this is a 36-inch by 36-inch card table, a very simple one, and then I put a cutting board that I use for cutting DIY foam core stuff and other things like that on here, which is a perfect opportunity to be able to use it for DIY as well. So the most important thing is that we need a little bit of room in the middle for the work. We're not going to build anything this time, but just to show you what it is, the first thing that we're going to do in our next episode is build a digital oscilloscope that I bought from Amazon, so you can see the materials that we have here. some of the stuff for boxes and instructions, power supply. But here and here are all of the primary materials that we need to be able to build it. The 2 PCBs and the components inside and so forth for what looks like is a really pretty simple and straightforward build. So that's the first thing you need, all your stuff. Then the second thing, of course, is a soldering iron. The soldering iron that I use is the Hakko 936, which is in 2 pieces. It's got the box back here, which you can set the temperature on and get everything ready and move it out of the way. There's the power button right there. And then here is the pen area. Now, I like this for a lot of different reasons. First of all, if you need to, you can buy a new pen system and connect it right up so you don't have to replace the soldering station. I love the feeling of their pen. It's very easy to replace the solder tips. And this device that you place the soldering iron in to rest is great. This here is just a simple piece of sponge that I cut and that I just put right into this area. And before you start, you fill it with water, and then as you solder, you clean off the soldering iron by wiping it on the wet sponge. I've owned a lot of inexpensive Weller pen type of soldering irons in the past, and the number of times I've spent $25 over and over and over again to replace them was made up for by spending whatever this was, $75 or $100 for this one soldering iron that I've used for many years. The next thing that you need, of course, is a place to be able to hold your work and the solder, and I do both of these things. I kill 2 birds with 1 stone. So this is a Panavice system to be able to hold PCB boards. It's fancy, but it's really nice. And again, I bought it once and I can use it all the time. You can move the angle of the thing around all you want. Makes it really easy to be able to fit any size PCB board. You stick it in, and then you stick it in like this, and then you flip that and it just pushes and puts a little pressure on it to hold it in place. It's very easy to be able to put resistors and capacitors and components in the front, and then you can turn it around and solder from the back, or you can do it more like this, put it in and then turn around and solder it that way, or you can solder, with certain PCB boards, you can solder right from the top, so you can put the resistor in and then solder it as well from the same angle. This thing has been really great, and I love this aspect of it particularly because I just put the solder right on this little thing. It's like a toilet paper roll, and then as you work, it just comes off and you use it. So getting this has been absolutely fantastic. And then of course the other aspect of this that's important is you have all of these little dishes in here for all of the teeny tiny components that you're working with. So, you end up putting a lot of the leads off of resistors and so forth that you clip off down here out of the way, and you put your new components in here, and you hold them there until you're ready to work with them. So, second most important thing. Third most important thing are these two. These are both from Exolite, which is the manufacturer that I use for all of these tools and have for many years. This is a pair of diagonal cutters. I believe they're 4.5 inches, and they're small, and they're absolutely perfect for clipping the ends off of components. And this is a really beat up, nasty pair of needle nose pliers. These are both by Exolite. My new pair of needle nose pliers is on the way. These are embarrassing, but the new ones will be coming. These are the two primary things that you really need in order to be able to work with putting components into a PCB board. Simple as that. The next thing that you need is light. So here I just have a very simple, nothing fancy, old beat up light, and it's got a fluorescent bulb in it so that I can see what's going on here. If you don't have good light, you can't see what you're doing and you make mistakes. The next thing that you really need is a thing called a multimeter or a multimeter, which is this device right here. This is something, it costs about $35 or so, and it allows you to be able to measure things like both DC and AC voltage, as well as resistance values, all the way from 0 up to 200 million ohms. And it's a very simple and very important device. It uses just a couple of leads like this, one for red, one for black. Typically when working on components like this, I have little alligator clips attached to these things, so rather than using these big things, I can just take two little alligator clips and put them on the ends of whatever it is that I'm trying to measure. I can't imagine debugging an audio circuit without having something like this, so it's just consider it as a very important part of what it is that you have within your electronics kit. Now, a couple of other things. Nice set of screwdrivers. Always use them. Again, I use Exolite. I just really like the quality of their stuff. I've bought it once and used it over and over again forever. Then another little set of various screw heads that I can plug into this thing and be able to use for anything you might need. Here I have a wire cutter that allows you to be able to strip the end off of wire. You've probably seen some simpler ones that just look like a pair of pliers with little holes in them. Those work as well, but I've had this one for a long time. And as you can see, you always need to strip the ends off of wire when you're doing DIY. So you put it in there, hold it down, click it, and there it is. And there is the wire with the copper available now for you to be able to tin and connect up to whatever it is that you need. I also have a few other colors of wire. These are all stranded wire. I have blue, red, black, and green. I have whatever I have. It's nice to be able to color code things somewhat so that you can follow the signal routing a little bit easier. The thing I have back here is a set of Kimtech science wipes. These are delicate wipers that you use for electronics. I like them because they don't fall apart. They don't have fiber and stuff that gets stuck within the electronics. It's just a cloth for a little Kleenex for cleaning things up like that. Then just a couple of other things that you really need. This is called a solder sucker. And so when you make a mistake and you put solder where you don't want it, you take this thing, which is a little vacuum, you push it in so that it's armed, then this end right here, you put it right on the hot solder and push the button, and it sucks the solder into the compartment in here so that you can use that to be able to clean up the mess. Another way of doing it is using this, which is this braided copper. So this material, you put it down onto wherever it is that you want to remove the solder, and then heat this with the soldering iron, and what happens is the solder that's underneath it wicks up into this copper braid. And so I use both of them depending upon what it is that's going on the circuit board and depending upon which I have more room for. So that is almost it. This is a set of helping hands which you can use to be able to hold stuff in place. So there's, in this case, a little magnifying glass, and then a pair of alligator clips that you can use to be able to attach anything, a couple different sides, and then be able to get in there and do whatever the work is that you need to do. So really useful. Now that I have this Panavice device here, I don't need it quite as much because the Panavice does a good job of holding any PCB boards in place, but you never know when you have small things that you need to hold, and having a set of helping hands like that is good. As I mentioned before, this magnifying glass is really important. I also have one of those jeweler's masks that you wear that has 2 times, 4 times, and 10 times magnification that you're looking through at all times. I thought that I was done soldering for good because my eyes had deteriorated to the point where I could no longer, really reliably see what was going on the board. Those magnifiers have changed everything, and it's made it really easy for me to continue soldering, which is wonderful. So this right here, because of the fact that I am inside the house, I have purchased a Hakko FA400 smoke absorber. So this thing has got this activated charcoal filter here. It has a fan inside of it that sucks all of the smoke. So as you're soldering here, this fan sucks the smoke through there. All of the particulates get caught up in the charcoal, and then the supposedly clean air gets vented out that way. You absolutely need something like this if you're going to be working inside. As I said earlier, if you're working outside or if you're working next to an open window with a fan pushing the fumes out that way, that works as well. But since neither of those two things are available for me, I'm experimenting with using this device instead. What does all this cost? Well, You can get started for as little as $100 or $200 to have the tools. Little by little, if you really get into it and you do it, you'll eventually replace the cheaper tools with the better tools. These Exolites are about 20 bucks each. This Hako was maybe $80. The soldering iron was maybe 100, 120. Good soldering tips, another few bucks. $25 for a set of nice screwdrivers, and probably 40 bucks for a good multimeter. There's not that much stuff, and you pick it up over time, so it doesn't really matter. The thing that I would say that's the most important is it's always better to buy one good thing than two cheap things. And so if you're getting into this and you think that this is a hobby that you're really going to like, start without having a lot of stuff, but get the stuff that's really good. Start with with a good pair of diagonal cutters and a good pair of needle nose pliers and a good soldering iron. And basically that's what you need really to get started. And as you get into it and as you do more and more and more of it, then every time you save up money to buy like another modular kit, you can take some of that money instead and use it to buy another piece of equipment for your building area. And before you know it, you'll have everything you need. I haven't bought a new piece of electronics DIY equipment for quite some time. And so before you know it, you'll have everything you need, and then you'll be ready to start building modules. DIY electronics is a great way to fill out your modular collection. If you think about it, every design that Don Buchla and Bob Moog made was DIY. They had to sit there at the soldering iron for eons, experimenting with connecting different components together until their masterpieces were born. So we follow in pretty big footsteps when we start thinking about resistors and capacitors. My favorite thing about DIY is the thrill of finishing a module, powering it up, and, if it works, enjoying the satisfaction of hearing it cooperating with all the rest of my modules in making music. I hope you will feel encouraged to go for it as well, and to enjoy the pride of craftsmanship when you plug into a module you built. So that's it for this episode of Under the Big Tree. If you like, join the conversation by sharing your thoughts and experiences on this topic in the comments below. As always, if you like what we're doing here on Under the Big Tree, please feel free to like, share, and subscribe. For now, this is Nick, signing off.